Billionaire's daughter brutally beat an elderly woman to death unaware who she really was until the haunting began. Chapter 1. The incident. The rain had been falling over Hartwell City for 3 days straight. It came down in cold, relentless sheets, the kind of rain that soaked through coats and settled into bones, the kind that made ordinary people hurry home to warmth and ordinary people feel grateful for whatever small shelter they had. It was the kind of rain that reminded you, if you were paying attention, that the world did not care who you were or how much money your father had. But Angela Steve had never paid attention to things like that. She was 23 years old, the only daughter of Samson Steve, the most powerful billionaire in the entire region of Hartwell. Her father owned 4 hotels, 2 private hospitals, a logistics company, and enough politicians to make sure his name never appeared in any newspaper without the word asterisk philanthropist somewhere nearby. Angela had grown up in a 16-bedroom mansion on Ridgemont Hill, attended the finest schools in Europe, and had never once, not once in her entire life, been told the word asterisk no and had it stick. She sat in the back seat of her white Mercedes G-Wagon, watching her driver navigate through the evening traffic on Callaway Street. Her nails were freshly done a deep crimson that matched her lipstick. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and she was in the middle of a furious argument with her personal assistant about a dinner reservation that had been made at the wrong restaurant. "I said Lumiere," Angela snapped, her voice sharp and cold as a scalpel. "Not Lumino, not La Lumiere, Lumiere. How many times do I have to spell things out for people who are supposed to be professionals?" Her driver, Marcus, kept his eyes forward. He had worked for the Steve family for 11 years. He had learned long ago to become invisible. The car slowed as the traffic thickened near the intersection of Callaway and Marsh Street. It was a busy corner. A small night market had set up along the sidewalk despite the rain. Vendors selling hot food under sagging tarps, people moving quickly with umbrellas and hooded jackets. And there, near the edge of the road, partially blocking the narrow lane that Marcus needed to turn into, stood an old woman. She was perhaps 75, maybe older. She wore a faded blue coat that had clearly been mended several times at the elbows, a plastic rain cap over her white hair, and she carried 2 large fabric shopping bags, the kind people reuse because they cannot afford to throw things away. She was moving slowly, carefully, because the puddle at the corner was deep, and she was trying to find a dry way around it. One of her bags had split at the seam, and she was struggling to gather the spilled contents: a small bag of oranges, a packet of rice, a worn Bible back into the broken carrier. Her name was Esther. Esther Miriam Cole. She had lived in the Marsh Street neighborhood for 40 years. She was known by every vendor on that block, every child on that corner. She had been a schoolteacher for 31 years before her retirement. She volunteered every Saturday at St. Michael's Soup Kitchen. She had raised 3 children alone after her husband passed, and she had done it with dignity and grace and a faith that never wavered. She was, in every sense that truly mattered, a great woman. But Angela did not see any of that. Angela saw an obstacle. "Marcus," she said, lowering her phone. "Why are we stopped?" "There's an elderly woman in the lane, ma'am. She's gathering her honk." Marcus hesitated. "She's moving, ma'am, just," I said. "Honk." He pressed the horn once, gently. The old woman looked up, startled by the sudden blare, and her remaining bag slipped from her grip. More groceries scattered across the wet pavement. She bent down slowly, her knees clearly painful, and began gathering them again. Angela watched for 4 seconds. Then she opened her door. "Angela," Marcus began. She was already out of the car. The rain hit her immediately, soaking her hair, dotting her designer blouse with dark spots, and this, more than anything, ignited the fury that was always burning just below her surface. She stormed toward the old woman, her heels clicking against the wet road, her eyes blazing. "Are you serious right now?" Angela's voice cut through the noise of the market like a blade. People nearby turned to look. "Do you have any idea how long you've been standing in the middle of the road? Do you even see a car in front of you? Are you blind on top of being useless?" Esther looked up. Her eyes, deep brown, steady, kind, met Angela's. She did not flinch. There was no fear in them, there was something closer to sorrow. "I am sorry, my dear," Esther said, her voice soft and unhurried. "My bag tore. I will be out of your way in just a moment. Your moment is over." Angela reached out and shoved Esther's shoulder hard, not a push. A shove. The kind meant to move someone. The kind meant to humiliate. The old woman stumbled backward. Her heel caught the uneven edge of the curb, and Esther fell. She went down hard, too hard, the way elderly people fall when their bodies no longer have the reflexes to catch themselves. The back of her head connected with the raised concrete edge of the sidewalk with a sound that made two nearby vendors cry out. Her groceries scattered across the wet road. Her rain cap spun away into a puddle. She did not get up. People rushed forward. Someone screamed. A vendor dropped his tray and knelt beside her, pressing two fingers to her neck, looking up with wide, horrified eyes. A woman nearby was already on her phone, voice shaking, calling for an ambulance. Angela stood very still in the rain. She looked at the old woman on the ground, at the stillness of her, the terrible, peaceful stillness, and something passed through Angela's face. It was not grief. It was not remorse. Not yet. It was the cold, creeping recognition of consequence. Esther Miriam Cole, retired schoolteacher, mother of three, servant of God, friend of strangers, was gone before the ambulance arrived. And Angela Steve had killed her. Chapter 2. The cover-up. The call lasted 4 minutes. That was all it took for Samson Steve to begin dismantling the truth. Angela had made it back into the Mercedes before her hands started shaking. Marcus had driven where, she didn't quite register, away from Calloway Street, away from the crowd that had gathered, away from the body of the woman she had pushed. She sat in the back seat with rain dripping from her hair onto the cream leather, staring at her phone screen for nearly 2 minutes before she pressed her father's name. Samson picked up on the second ring. "Daddy," she whispered. He heard everything in that one word. He always did. He had built an empire by reading people, by understanding in the space of a single syllable what someone needed and what they feared. He heard his daughter's voice and he did not ask questions. He said only, "Where are you?" She told him, "Say nothing to anyone. I am handling it." And he did. By midnight, 3 things had happened that should have been impossible. The first was that every piece of mobile phone footage recorded on Calloway Street that evening, and there were at least 6, had been remotely accessed, flagged, and wiped. Samson's head of digital security, a man who had done considerably darker work for considerably less money, had traced each device through the cell tower data, cross-referenced it with the carrier records his contacts provided, and made the footage disappear with a quiet efficiency that left no footprints. The second was that Marcus, Angela's driver, had received a visit from Samson's attorney before he had even reached his apartment building. The attorney, a tall, expressionless man named Clifford Reese, had explained, in precise and pleasant language, exactly what Marcus's options were. One option involved a generous settlement, a new vehicle, and a transfer to a comfortable position at the Steve family's estate in Portugal. The other option was described only in terms of what it was not. It was not pleasant. It was not something Marcus's family would thank him for, and it was not something that would end quickly. Marcus had signed the papers within the hour. The third thing was a call placed by Samson himself to the Deputy Commissioner of Hartwell City Police, a man named Bernard Holt, who had a mortgage on a house far beyond his salary, and whose last campaign for a promotion had been quietly funded by a holding company 4 degrees removed from Steve Global Enterprises. Commissioner Holt had listened carefully, said very little, and assured Samson that the evening's incident would be classified as an accidental fall. An elderly woman with a known heart condition who had collapsed near a busy intersection. The post-mortem would reflect this. The officer who had first responded to the scene had already been reassigned to a precinct across the city. By morning, Esther Cole had become a statistic. Elderly resident Esther M. Cole, 74, collapsed on Calloway Street Wednesday evening and was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities confirmed the incident was accidental. No suspicious circumstances found. 14 lines in the Hartwell City Gazette, page 7, below an advertisement for a garden center. Angela read it at the breakfast table, sitting in her father's sunlit dining room with a cup of coffee she didn't taste. Samson sat across from her, reading something on his tablet, his expression undisturbed, the expression of a man who had faced far larger crises and neutralized them all. "It's done," he said, without looking up. Angela set the newspaper down. "She had family," she said quietly. "I heard someone at the scene. She had children. Everyone has family." Samson finally looked at her. His eyes were not unkind. He loved his daughter, in his way, but they were the eyes of a man who had long since arranged his moral architecture to accommodate his ambitions. "Her family will be taken care of." Discreetly. Take care of how? Does it matter? It did matter. It should have mattered enormously. But Angela had been raised in this house, by this man, with this logic that problems could be solved, that money was the solution, and that the only thing more dangerous than making a mistake was admitting one. Looked away. She finished her coffee. She told herself it was over. But across the city, in a small apartment on Denfield Road, Esther Cole's youngest daughter, Grace, sat on her mother's narrow bed and held her mother's worn Bible to her chest and wept. Grace was 31. She taught primary school, the same way her mother had. She had called her mother that morning to check on her, the way she called every Wednesday, and the neighbor who answered the phone had told her in a broken voice what had happened. Grace had gone to the police station. She had been told the case was closed accidental. She had asked questions. She had been turned away. She had gone to the scene. She had spoken to one of the vendors, a woman named Rosaria, who sold empanadas from a cart. Rosaria had seen everything. Rosaria's eyes, when she described the white Mercedes and the young woman in the designer clothes, had been fierce and certain. But by the time Grace returned with a journalist, she knew Rosaria was gone. Her cart was gone. A new vendor had taken the spot and claimed he didn't know anyone named Rosaria. It was as if the whole street had been quietly erased. Grace stood on that corner for a long time, in the same rain that had not yet stopped, holding her mother's Bible and staring at the spot where Esther had fallen. The concrete was clean. Someone had washed it. She looked up at the sky and she said, very quietly, "Mama, I don't know how to fight this." And somewhere in whatever place, the souls of good women go. Esther heard her. Chapter 3. The supernatural reckoning. It began with the cold. Angela had always kept her bedroom at a precise 72 degrees. She had a thermostat installed specifically for the room, regulated, digital, dependable. But on the 7th night after Esther Cole's death, Angela woke at 3:17 in the morning to a cold so deep and so absolute that she could see her own breath rising in small white clouds in the darkness of her room. She sat up, reached for her phone, checked the thermostat app. It read 72 degrees. She told herself the sensor was glitching. She pulled her duvet tighter and lay back down and stared at the ceiling and waited for sleep to return. It didn't. The cold didn't lift. And after a long silence, she became aware of a sound, low, rhythmic, patient, coming from the direction of her ensuite bathroom. It sounded like humming, an old hymn. Slow and certain, the kind of song that has been sung so many thousands of times it has soaked into stone. Angela did not move for a full minute. Then, with the particular courage of someone who has convinced herself she is not afraid, she got out of bed and crossed to the bathroom doorway and pushed it open. The mirror was fogged. This was impossible. She had not showered, the room was freezing, there was no steam source. But the mirror was completely fogged, white and opaque, and as Angela stood in the doorway with her hand still on the frame, letters began to appear in the fog, slowly, deliberately, as though pressed by a finger from the other side. "You know what you did." Angela's throat closed. She slammed the bathroom door. Stood with her back against it, heart hammering, telling herself, screaming at herself internally that it was a trick of condensation, a trick of exhaustion, a trick of guilt that she refused to name. She stood there for 10 minutes, breathing. Then she turned back, opened the door again. The mirror was clear. The bathroom was warm. The humming was gone. She did not sleep again that night. She told no one. On the 9th day, she was in her car, a different car, a black Range Rover, because she had not been able to bring herself to ride in the white Mercedes again when her driver braked suddenly at a crosswalk. Angela looked up from her phone and her blood turned to ice. Standing on the opposite side of the crosswalk in the streaming afternoon light was an old woman in a faded blue coat. a plastic rain cap over white hair, two shopping bags in her hands. She was looking directly at Angela. Angela pressed herself back against the seat, a sound escaping her that was not quite a word. The light changed. The old woman walked forward slowly, carefully, the way she always had, and as she passed in front of the car, she turned her face toward the window where Angela sat, and for one terrible, elongated moment their eyes met. It was Esther's face. Then a bus passed between them, and when it was gone, the old woman was gone. Angela was shaking so violently she had to ask the driver to pull over. She sat on a bench outside a pharmacy and pressed her hands between her knees and told herself it was someone who simply resembled her. A coincidence. The guilt-contaminated projections of a mind that was beginning to crack under the weight of what it had done. But she knew she had felt it in her stomach the way you feel certain truths not in your mind, where denial lives but somewhere deeper, somewhere money cannot reach. On the 11th night, it was no longer subtle. Angela was alone in her bedroom. It was past midnight. She had taken 2 sleeping tablets, had turned on every lamp in the room, had left the television running at low volume. She had almost convinced herself that tiredness would claim her before anything else could. Then the television went off, every lamp went off. And in the darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the city through the curtains, a figure stood at the foot of her bed. It was Esther, not as Angela had last seen her crumpled on wet concrete, still and broken. She was as she must have been in full life, upright, composed, her eyes clear and deep as still water. She wore the blue coat. She held nothing. She simply stood there and looked at Angela with an expression that was not rage and was not cruelty and was, somehow, far worse than either. It was grief. And beneath the grief, an immovable authority. When Esther spoke, her voice was layered. It carried the weight of something older than language, older than courts, older than anything Samson Steve's money could influence. Angela could not move, could not speak. The cold was absolute again, the cold of deep stone, the cold of the space beneath the world. You took my life, Esther said. Not the years I had left, those were few. You took the end of my story. You took my daughter's last goodbye. You took my grandchildren's memory of a peaceful passing. You took Rosaria's courage when you sent your father's men to silence her. You took Grace's right to justice. Angela's eyes were burning. She still could not speak. I'm not here to punish you, Esther said. Punishment is not mine to give. A pause, long and weighted. But I'm here to tell you that the truth you buried is alive. It is growing. And you have 3 days before it rises to the surface on its own in a way that will leave nothing of your family's name intact. She leaned forward slightly, and her eyes held Angela's with a force that felt like gravity. 3 days, she said. Use them well. Or waste them. The choice, the only choice that was ever truly yours, is still yours. The lamps flickered back on. The television resumed. The figure was gone. Angela sat in her bright, warm, expensive room and shook for a very long time. Then she reached for her phone and called her father. Chapter 4. The moral collapse and transformation. Samson Steve did not believe in the supernatural. He was a man built from data and leverage, from contracts and calculated risk. He believed in what could be quantified, what could be purchased, and what could be suppressed. When Angela arrived at his study at 1 in the morning, pale as paper, and told him about the figure at the foot of her bed, about the mirror, about the old woman at the crosswalk, he listened with his hands folded on his desk and his expression carefully neutral. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're exhausted. You're carrying stress you haven't processed. The mind manufactures things under that kind of pressure. You need a therapist, a private one, someone discreet, and you need to step away from Hartwell for a few weeks. I can arrange for the villa in Daddy." Her voice broke on the word. "You didn't see her," was her asterisk. She pressed her fist to her chest. "I felt it here. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't stress. She was asterisk there, and she told me we have 3 days. Samson was quiet again. He looked at his daughter across the expanse of his mahogany desk, at the girl he had raised, the girl he had shielded from every consequence her entire life, and he saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. Not the fear. He had seen Angela afraid before. It was the clarity beneath the fear. It was the look of someone who was, perhaps for the first time, seeing themselves honestly. He did not sleep that night either. The next morning, it was not Angela who cracked first. It was Marcus. Marcus had told himself for 11 days that the money was enough, that the Portugal option was the rational choice, that Esther Cole's death was not his fault. He had been following instructions. He had not laid a hand on anyone. He was a driver who drove. He had signed the papers. He had cashed the first payment. He had told himself this story with the practiced desperation of someone who needs to believe it. But Marcus had a daughter. She was 8 years old, and she attended the primary school on Denfield Road, and her teacher, a young woman with her mother's steady eyes and her mother's quiet grace, was named Grace Cole. Marcus had not connected the name until he came to pick up his daughter on the third day after signing the papers, and he saw Grace Cole standing at the school gate looking at a photograph on her phone, and the photograph was of an old woman in a blue coat, and Marcus recognized the coat because he had watched that woman fall. He stood on the pavement outside the school and felt the full weight of what he had buried come crashing down on him. He called Clifford Reese and told him the arrangement was over. Then he called a journalist. Her name was Priya Sharma, and she worked for the Hartwell City Independent, a publication too small to be on Sampson's radar and too principled to be bought. She had been trying for 2 weeks to trace an anonymous tip about the Callaway Street incident, a tip that had arrived as a single handwritten note slipped under the editorial office door. She had hit walls everywhere. She had been threatened once obliquely by a man she couldn't place, but now she had Marcus. And Marcus remembered everything. By the end of that day, Priya Sharma had Marcus's testimony, a phone recording made by a vendor named Rosaria who had, it turned out, fled to her sister's house on the north side of the city, not disappeared, and a photograph taken by a schoolboy named Theo, 11 years old, who had been standing 20 feet away when the incident occurred, who had taken the picture on his mother's old phone, and who had never been asked about it because nobody had come looking. The truth that Sampson Steve had spent $3 million burying was sitting in a reporter's draft folder, ready to publish. It was the morning of the third day. Angela knew. She had felt it before the phone rang, before Sampson called her, in a voice she had never heard him use, a voice stripped of its confidence, its architecture, its power. He told her what Marcus had done, what the journalist had, what would be published by evening if they didn't. "We don't do anything," Angela said. A silence. "Angela, Daddy." Her voice was quiet, not the controlled quiet of suppression, but the new, raw quiet of someone who has made a decision they cannot take back. "We don't do anything. We don't call Clifford. We don't make any more calls to Commissioner Holt. We don't do any of it. It's over. If that article publishes, then it publishes." She was standing at her window, looking out at Hartwell City, at the rain that had finally stopped, at the ordinary morning light falling on ordinary streets. "I pushed an old woman. She died. I watched you make it go away, and I let you. I lived in this house for 11 days, and I slept in that bed, and I wore those clothes, and I tried to make myself believe it hadn't happened." Her voice wavered, held. "Mama used to say," "You remember what Mama used to say?" Sampson was silent. "She used to say that God doesn't erase debts. He just moves the due date." Angela turned from the window. "Daddy, it's due." There was a long, terrible pause on the line. And then something happened that Angela had never witnessed in 23 years of knowing her father. Sampson Steve began to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, just a small, quiet, exhausted sound, the sound of a man who has run very far and very fast and has arrived at last at the edge of a cliff he cannot cross. "I just wanted to protect you," he said. "That's all I know." She pressed her hand to her chest. "But protecting me from consequences isn't protecting me. It's just making me worse." That afternoon, Angela called Grace Cole directly. She had found the number through the school's public directory. Grace picked up on the third ring. Angela said, "My name is Angela Steve, and I need you to know that I'm sorry, not because a journalist found out, not because a ghost told me I had 3 days." A pause. "Because your mother deserved better than what I gave her, and you deserve better than what my father did after. And I am going to stand in front of anyone who needs to hear it, and I'm going to say exactly what happened. No lawyers, no spin, just the truth." Grace Cole did not speak for a very long time. Then she said, "My mother forgave people. It was the thing about her that I never fully understood until now." Another pause. "She would want me to say that I hear you, not that I'm okay, but that I hear you. It was not forgiveness." It was not absolution. But it was a door cracked open in the wall that Angela had built with a single terrible shove on a rainy Wednesday evening. That evening, before Priya Sharma's article published, Angela Steve walked into the Hartwell City Police Department's Central Precinct. She asked to speak with the officer in charge, and she told them everything. Chapter 5. Resolution: the trial lasted 9 weeks. It was the kind of trial that fills courtrooms, every seat taken, cameras outside, people who had never known Esther Cole suddenly certain that they had, their indignation worn like a badge. The press was everywhere. Priya Sharma's article, when it published the morning after Angela walked into the precinct, had detonated across every platform. The photograph taken by 11-year-old Theo, slightly blurred, taken from below, capturing the moment of Angela's shove with terrible clarity, became the image that defined the case. Theo's mother had wept on television. Theo himself had been calm and factual in a way that made the courtroom go very still. Samson Steve's network of influence had collapsed with a speed that surprised even those who had always suspected its existence. Commissioner Holt resigned within the first week and was subsequently charged with obstruction of justice. Clifford Reese's firm lost 7 major clients before his formal disbarment proceedings began. The 3 city officials who had signed off on the post-mortem falsification were placed on administrative leave and charged. Marcus testified for the prosecution. He sat in the witness stand with his hands folded on the ledge and answered every question in a clear, unhurried voice. Afterward, Grace Cole, who attended every day of the trial, nodded at him from across the gallery. It was a small nod, but he held on to it. Rosaria testified too. She had been afraid, still was, in some ways, but she had come back to Hartwell with her footage and her voice, and a composure that seemed to draw from some deep well of anger that had been quietly filling for years. When she described watching Esther try to gather her groceries from the wet road, and the sound when she fell, and the look on Angela's face in the first seconds after the courtroom was completely silent, Angela did not take the stand to minimize what she had done. She stood, not sat, stood, because her attorney had told her she could sit, and she had said she would stand, and she looked at the courtroom, and she said, "I pushed her. I pushed her because she was in my way, and because I had never once in my life been taught that other people's bodies were something I needed to respect. I watched her fall, and my first thought was not for her. My first thought was about myself. I'm ashamed of that in a way I don't have adequate language for." She turned her gaze toward Grace, who was sitting in the 3rd row. "Esther Cole was worth more than I understood. She was worth more than I have the capacity to fully understand even now. What I took from this world when I took her from it, I can't give back. I know that. But I can spend the rest of my life making sure that what I give going forward reflects what I now understand her life was worth." The judge sentenced her to 6 years, with a reduction for her voluntary confession, her cooperation with the investigation, and the absence of a prior record. She served just under 5. She served them without complaint. The prison was called Hartwell Correctional Center, and it was nothing like the places Angela had been before. The first months were the hardest, not for the reasons she might have anticipated, not the loss of luxury or the loss of freedom, but for the relentless intimacy of the place. She had never in her life been unable to leave a room. She had never shared a space with 40 women whose stories were as real and as complicated and as deserving of attention as her own. She had never, before the age of 23, understood that other people's pain was not background noise. She learned it there. She earned her certification as a social work assistant in her 3rd year. She helped other inmates with legal literacy. She learned to listen, not the performative listening of someone waiting for their own turn to speak, but the deep, patient listening that Esther had clearly spent a lifetime practicing. She thought about Esther often. She thought about the worn Bible. She thought about the steady eyes. She did not see Esther again. She didn't need to. Samson Steve's legal proceedings dragged across 2 years and cost him most of what he had built. He did not fight it. This was the thing that surprised people most. The man who had leveraged everything to silence a truth did not, once the truth was out, try to fight its consequences. He paid every settlement. He cooperated with every investigation. He dissolved 3 of his holdings to meet the financial judgments against him. He grew old very quickly, in the way that men do when they stop believing in their own invincibility. He visited Angela every month without fail. He brought her books. He brought her things her mother had left, small things: a bracelet, a folded letter, a pressed flower from a garden Angela barely remembered. And once a month they sat across a table from each other and talked the way they had never talked when they were wealthy and powerful and unreachable, honestly, about ordinary things and about difficult things, about regret and about what, if anything, comes after regret. In the second year, Samson sold the Ridgemont Hill mansion. He bought, with the proceeds and what remained of his operating capital after legal fees, a decommissioned community building on the south side of Hartwell, 3 blocks from where Esther had lived for 40 years. He renovated it himself, not personally, but present for every decision, in the building every day, learning the names of the contractors and the structural engineers and the plumbers. He had never before been in a room with people who worked with their hands without feeling that they were somehow less than him. He learned that they were not. When the building was finished, it was painted a clean white with deep blue trim. There was a mural on the exterior wall, commissioned from a local artist, a woman in a blue coat, warm and upright and full of quiet authority, surrounded by the faces of the neighborhood she had served. Beneath her, in simple black letters, the Esther Cole Foundation, *A shelter for those who need shelter, a table for those who need to eat, a door that is always open. Grace Cole attended the opening. She stood in front of the mural for a long time, not speaking, her hand pressed flat against the painted blue coat. Then she turned to Samson, who was standing a few feet away looking at the ground, and she said, she would have hated having a building named after her. A pause. And she would have loved every single person you put inside it. Samson nodded. He couldn't speak for a moment. I know, he finally managed. That's why I did it. Angela walked out of Hartwell Correctional Center on a Thursday morning in April. It was not raining. The sky was a clean, pale blue, the kind of sky that seems newly washed, and the air smelled of early spring soil and new leaves and the particular freshness that comes after a long winter. She had 1 bag. She wore jeans and a plain gray jacket, clothes that Grace had sent, because Angela had asked her if there was anything that had belonged to Esther that she might use, and Grace had understood and had sent something ordinary and warm and good. Her father was waiting outside. He was thinner than she remembered. His hair was fully white now. He stood beside a modest car, not a Mercedes, not a Range Rover, just a blue sedan, and he watched her come through the door with an expression that held everything: guilt and love and pride and grief and something new, something that hadn't been there before, something that might be called wisdom if you were generous, and hard-won understanding if you were precise. She walked up to him. She put her arms around him. They stood there for a while without speaking, 2 people who had once been almost entirely defined by what they had, now defined tentatively, imperfectly, genuinely by what they understood. There's someone who wants to see you, he said, when they finally separated. Grace Cole was waiting at the Esther Foundation. She was standing inside, near the dining hall, where volunteers were already preparing for the lunch service. The building smelled of cooking and warmth, and the particular aliveness of a space that is truly used. Children's drawings covered one wall. Residents of the shelter who had been given art supplies and told to make it theirs. A woman at a corner table was reading from a worn Bible to a small group of people who were new to the shelter and looked afraid. Angela stood in the doorway and watched it all and felt the full weight of what had been built from the rubble of what she had destroyed. Grace walked toward her. She was wearing her mother's warmth in a way that Angela could not explain except to say that it was unmistakable in the steadiness of her walk, the openness of her face, the quality of her attention when it landed on you. You came, Grace said. You said the offer was still open, Angela replied. Her voice was careful, hopeful. For the social work position, it is. Grace looked at her for a long moment, not with cruelty, not with performance, with the honest, searching look of someone deciding how much trust to extend and in which direction. I won't pretend it's not strange. It will be strange for a while. Maybe for a long while, I know. But my mother believed that the point of a wrong done was not to end a person. The point was to turn them. Grace held out her hand. She would want you turned, not destroyed. Angela took her hand, held it. I've been turned, she said quietly. I'm still turning. Grace nodded. Aren't we all? It was Angela's fourth week at the foundation when a young woman arrived at the door on a Tuesday afternoon, 20-something, expensive coat, expensive car keys in her hand, eyes wide with the specific helplessness of someone who has never before stood at a door asking for something. She explained, haltingly, that her grandmother had been admitted to the shelter 2 weeks ago following an eviction, and that she, the granddaughter, had only just found out because they had been estranged, and she didn't know how to, she wasn't sure what she was asking for exactly. She just wanted to. Angela looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in. I'll take you to her." The young woman blinked, surprised by the ease of it, the uncomplicated openness. "Thank you," she said. "That's what the door is for," Angela told her. And she meant it. Somewhere in Hartwell City, in a small apartment on Denfield Road, a worn Bible sits on a shelf beside a photograph. A woman in a blue coat, warm and upright, looking directly at the camera with eyes that know exactly who she is and what she is worth. Below the photograph, in Grace Cole's handwriting, a single line on a folded piece of paper. She taught us that the greatest power is the power you freely give away. Outside, the city moves in its ordinary way, its traffic and its markets, its ambitions and its small graces, its powerful and its forgotten, and all the complex, irreducible humanity between. And in a building painted white with blue trim, a door is open. It is always open. Please subscribe, like, share, turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The ENDNEXT.